shopping day of the year. It happens
Yeah.
right after Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving was yesterday. We had a very big meal here at my house, and
Okay. It
now
was
is
yesterday. It was yesterday, yes.
yes, and now is the big shopping day where everyone goes out and the stores are full, and people look for sales.
At this point, unfortunately, well, we cannot hear you. Neither can we see you.
Yes, it looks like I'm getting kicked off every 2 minutes or so from the microphone and the video. So every few minutes
Well,
I need to reestablish it.
all right.
Okay, great. So
Well, I see. Well, what we have agreed on developments in U.S. education. Very good.
great. So let's start with so if we can just expand that perhaps so we can see the full slide. Is that possible, Maria? Okay, perfect. Some things might be cut off at the bottom, but let's see. So yes, my name is Dr. Weiss. It's been a few years since I've been in Russia, and I'm really happy to give this talk on developments in U.S. education. I was asked to focus on the perceptions of U.S. high school students, and then also the admission process into university. So that is the trajectory that I will go through. Of course, developments in education is a very broad topic. And during the Q&A session, if you have any other interests in other developments or trends that you would like me to address, please feel free to ask. In order to get to the perception of high school students and how they get into college and the admissions process, I need to give you a little bit of a background on the U.S. education system. And I'm going to do that in a bit of a data-driven way, and to show you how from a very young age, students progress through the system, what works, what hasn't worked, and what type of intervention.
At the moment, we cannot hear you. Sorry.
And the next slide, please. The one that says domains of responsibility. Great, thank you. So the U.S. education system is a tri-tiered institution. And there are different responsibilities at the federal, state, and the local level. Just to give you a very brief overview, next slide, please. At the federal level, that is Washington, D.C., the U.S. government, there are certain federal regulations and mandates that are tied to funding. These trickle down at the local level, at the school level, but they're mandated and controlled at the federal level. They are, for example, equal rights for women, requirements that students with disabilities who are in special education receive certain services, and also at-risk families receive both education and related services. At the state level, where most of the funding comes from, there is a state board that oversees the curriculum and testing requirements. What the important part about this is, for the overall picture of college admission, is that each state is determining their own curriculum, right? So New York is not having the same curriculum or testing requirements as California or New Jersey or Michigan or Florida. Now, this can be positive in that the state can control, right, the level of education, but it also can be negative because disparities in funding, disparities in textbook and educational resources can lead to one state having more advantage than the other. And at the local level, there's budget oversights. There's a superintendent who oversees the minutia of what goes on in education. Next slide, please. Now, as I was saying, the actual percentage of the taxpayer income is very different from state to state. You can see on the right side where it says 5.0, that is New York State. I am living in Brooklyn in New York City. That's where I'm speaking to you from my son's room. And New York spends a lot more money than of their local taxpayer income than, say, California, which is at 3.2, or Alaska, which is at 4.1. Now, does that correlate into achievement, which prepares students from an early age and allows them to gain admission to university? We can see on the next slide, please. Great. As you can see, this is average test score district. So when you look at the blue is not where you want to be. The blue means that relative to the US average, there is a deficiency, a negative. And the greener it gets, as the saying goes, it's greener on the other side. It's much better if it's green. So you can see, if you look to the right, I can't use my cursor here, but that kind of big state on the northeast, that is New York. And we saw that New York had a 5% of the taxpayer money, and there is a lot more green in the New York area, especially where the cities are. As we start to move out to the rural area, there is less achievement. If we look at California over on the West Coast, we can see it's almost entirely blue, with the exception of some school districts in larger. I cut out again, didn't I? Okay. So I was on, did you hear what I said about California or not? The mic cut off again. Okay, so when we look at California, we can see it is mostly blue, except for some cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco. Next slide, please. Now, taking a look, we're going to talk more about the college admission process, what I was asked to talk about in a few minutes. But when we look at the disparities in funding and educational achievement across the country, we also want to see what percentage of students who start university are taking remedial courses. Remedial courses, of course, are ones that are lower level, that are probably advanced high school level, and they're meant for first-year college students who are not up to the academic level. And we can see there is a fairly large percentage of American students who do need to take remedial classes when they do enter university. And one of the roles of the federal and state government is to try and mitigate these issues, to make sure that everyone who attends a university is prepared to engage in academic work at a university level. And that starts very early on. And one issue is funding, but another issue has to do with social and racial and economic demographics. Next slide, please. we can see that the fourth grade reading level, and the fourth grade is sort of a benchmark, a baseline in the United States to test the achievement. It's towards the end of elementary school, and we can see how students are doing after 4 or 5 years of schooling. And we can see there's a huge disparity between achievement between Asian students who have been increasing achievement in reading over Native Hawaiian and African American and Hispanic. And these are some of the issues that the Department of Education at the federal level is looking to mitigate. We can also see this in math scores. Next slide, please. Right. We can see the same thing. The Asian line is represented in green. These statistics are from the Department of Education, United States, based on the National Assessment of Educational Progress mathematics assessments. We can see that the Asian American students are performing significantly better, and they are increasing over the past decade their scores, where the Latino population is slightly increasing, but there's test scores, but it is still significantly lower than the Asian and white. Next slide, please. Right. And the last slide here from the Department of Education, we can see overall high school completion, high school graduation rates are reflected in those test scores. It's mirrored in the test scores. There's a correlation between achievement from fourth grade English and math and actual graduation from high school. So we see that the groups that are achieving in fourth grade are graduating at a significantly higher rate than the students who are not achieving in fourth grade. Now, this is high school completion rate. When we take a step forward to university, next slide, please. We can see college enrollment by race and ethnicity in the United States. If we look on the left, we can see that the Asian American population is going to college at a significantly higher rate. And from 1990 to 2010 and 2020 has increased significantly. If we look at the African American population, there is an increase from 1990, 2000 to 2010, but then a dip off in 2020. Now, even at its apex in 2010, the African American population has about a 37% college enrollment rate, whereas the Asian American population is at 64%. So these are some of, when we talk about admissions to college and college readiness, we have to also look from the federal and state optic and how government officials are looking, educational officials, of course, in the government, and looking to somehow make sure that students are prepared from a very early age to achieve and to move forward and become college ready. Next slide, please. So two of the major interventions that have tried to mitigate, right, these statistical inequalities that we've seen are No Child Left Behind and Head Start. No Child Left Behind was initiated in the early 2000s and hasn't been extremely successful. It is a very data-driven initiative where schools are rated based on high-stakes testing and achievement. And when students are not succeeding to a certain rate, then the school can be taken over by the state or federal government, and new superintendent, new principal can be put in place. This is meant to level the field so everyone is reaching a certain level of achievement. Unfortunately, what this has done is teachers are teaching to the test and foregoing a lot of effective foregoing a lot of effective methodology in order for students to pass. So it's a teaching to the test initiative. More successful has been Head Start, which starts when children are 4, sometimes 5 years old. And interestingly enough, students who are participating in early childhood education have achieved are 2.7% more likely to complete high school and 8.5% more likely to enroll in college. So this has been a more effective initiative. As you can see, it does depend on the particular school. We have different studies by Ludwig and Miller, 2007, which looks at a time series across 10 years where Head Start has had a 3% impact. More recent studies have looked at the whether a student whose mother, for example, has less education in high school, there is an 11% impact in the student going to college. And in some of the more effective schools, it can go up to 19, 20%. So Head Start has been a very effective way of preparing students for college. Next slide, please. Now, this slide from Hamilton's project from Brookings Institute does show also by ethnicity that Head Start is benefiting the African American and Hispanic population particularly. So this has been an effective policy implemented across the board, across the country, but implemented differently in states and also in cities. New York has different Head Start programs than Los Angeles does, than Chicago does. And that is reflected in the success of students graduating college and moving forward. Now, at a federal level, следующий,
Okay.
пожалуйста.
Yes.
Maria, when you have a chance, if you can just move to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, and I'll talk briefly about one more initiative, and then we'll kind of go on to the pedagogical approaches. We'll talk about high school in America, high school admissions, and then we'll move into the college admissions process. So 41 out of the 50 states in the United States implement what is called And based on that research, they will present their findings, and this will be used as an assessment. So it's looking at alternative ways to assess students. There's also a large degree of experiential learning being infused, where students will undergo firsthand experience going to a museum or going to a workplace or going to research historical documents. Historical documents, and so based learning, experiential learning our advantage. So that means that there's a lot of blended learning going on. COVID, a lingering impact on academic education. So if you find, thank you, Maria, if you find the slide that is, you see COVID-19, and if you could click on that one. Дальше, пожалуйста. Okay, next. Okay, so, okay, go a bit earlier. 3 earlier, please. Okay. So, okay, that's great. Thank you. So, COVID, we can look at from fall 2018 to fall 2022, pre-COVID and during COVID, and we can see that, especially for individuals in the United States who fall under the moderate to high poverty baseline, that they are still having difficulty with their achievement, and there was a noticeable fall off. All students went down 3 percentage points in their learning, but students who fall under that moderate to high poverty category fell off 5%, 5.5%. Next slide, please. So, interestingly enough, when we look at the literature, we see that family education is often a predictor of academic success and success in the domain of college admissions more so than income, with the exception of some top schools, which we'll discuss in a moment. However, during COVID, interestingly enough, income was more of a predictor of whether a student would drop off or not. Students who came from wealthier families were more successful in managing their education during the COVID pandemic. Now, there are a lot of different theories in the literature as to why this is the case. One is that students who come from wealthier backgrounds had less responsibilities at home, less family members they needed to take care of. A lot of high school students had younger siblings who had to stay home, who they had to watch. Another has to do with metacognitive skills, that students from stronger socioeconomic backgrounds had developed stronger metacognitive skills, which enabled them to organize their work more and deal with issues like depression, lack of communal involvement. The jury is not out when we look at the more robust econometrics. Those are some of the variables. Next slide, please. So, moving towards high school admissions and then moving towards college admissions, which I was asked to discuss. And now you can kind of get a better picture of how students get accepted to college, because we know the background of what has impacted their learning from an early age. Because high school admission and then finally college admission, it's not a phenomenon that works in a vacuum. Right? It's impacted by prior years of education. So for high school admissions, typically in the United States, students go to high school where they are geographically located. So if I'm located in Mamaroneck, New Jersey, I would go to the high school in Mamaroneck, New Jersey. With bigger cities like New York and Los Angeles, students usually vie for the handful of very good high schools rather than go to a high school that they're located near. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at the next slide, we'll see that I'll use New York as an example because New York has the biggest public school district in the United States with over 1 million students. That there are specialized high schools, and there are 12 big specialized high schools. And in order to get into these high schools, you need to take a standardized exam. Oh, that's New York. That's where I live. That's Central Park in the middle. Can we go to the next slide, please? So these specialized high schools that you see their emblem there, Staten Island Tech, Brooklyn Tech, Bronx Science, these are all very competitive schools. Next slide, please. Now, what I showed you earlier about fourth grade achievement and high school achievement, there is also a correlation between acceptance into the strongest public schools, which are some of the best in the country. We can see that Asian students who are very successful at the fourth grade level, at the elementary and middle school level, who represent only 14% of New York City's population, in fact, are represented almost 52% at the specialized high schools. Whereas the Latino population, which is 29% and growing in New York City, only represents 6.3%. So we can see when it comes to specialized high schools, ones that will get you into and prepare you for colleges like Harvard and Yale and MIT and Caltech, Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to go into the many court cases involving education in the United States, but just to mention one, there has been a lot of not just talk, but there have been a lot of cases, right, in state and Supreme Court in the United States related to getting into these top high schools. Because if you get into one of these high schools and you succeed, you're far more likely to get into a better college. So a lot of these specialized high schools have tried to move and have affirmative action criteria, meaning that if you come from a minority group, Latino or African American, you can gain a spot with slightly lower scores. So students who, for example, did not succeed in the specialized high school entrance exam, but almost succeeded, if they are from one of those minority groups, they can gain a spot. And a lot of the Asian parents were not pleased about that, white as well, and they took this to court. And these are ongoing issues in the United States, and these relate to the developments in education from the jurisprudential side. Right? There's an argument that from the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution, that racial diversity discriminates against other people, and that should not be part of the admissions criterion for going to a good school. That has been the decision in Seattle and with the Supreme Court, but has not been decided yet in New York. Next slide, please. So how do American high school students perceive high school? Do they feel prepared for college? Do they enjoy it? A lot of the perception surveys show that it really depends on not just academics, but extracurricular activities. When students are part of clubs, when they engage in sports or non-athletic clubs, when they have bigger social groups, they do feel more satisfied. However, many students don't feel prepared for university when they leave, and it really depends on the high school. What we know about American high school from Netflix, next slide, please. Next slide, Maria. Yeah, this is kind of what we know from American high school. There's Stranger Things. Everyone is kind of has their little social groups, and there are small classes, and the 11 with all the powers is presenting a little model. But in fact, the classes in the cities tend to be very overcrowded, and in some of the more rural areas or towns, especially ones with wealthier communities, there is a much lower teacher to student ratio. Now, when we look at satisfaction, a lot of students from wealthier schools, they say they are prepared for college. A lot of students from urban schools, especially the non-specialized, they need to take remedial classes when they get to university. Next slide, please. When we look at satisfaction, with K to 12 education, a lot of parents are not particularly satisfied with the current one. This is from a Gallup poll in 2023, sample size 692. And we can see that right now, only 8% of Americans are completely satisfied with the education, and parents a bit more at 14%. However, when parents are looking at their oldest child's educational quality, so that could range from a year to 15, 20 years, it wasn't clear in the time series, they're far more satisfied. Next slide, please. this is interesting because most K-12 parents view the teachers positively. So there were only 14% of parents who said that their child's education was great and they were completely satisfied with the outcome when they graduated high school, but 36% said that the teachers were excellent. So the conclusion we can make here is perhaps that the curriculum is not preparing the students as well. Next slide, please. Interestingly, for those of you who work on scholarship related to different states or different political parties and how they view education, we can see that the Republican Party has manifested a noticeable dissatisfaction over the past few years in how they view education. In the last 5 years, it has dipped off significantly. So there is a political divide in how parents view education, and that does relate to the Common Core and the standards that are being put in the Common Core. Now, next slide, please. When high school students are asked if they want to go to college, and those who say it is very important or somewhat important, you'll notice that it is mostly about making money. Conspicuously absent among these four primary determinants on the reason to obtain a college degree is learning. So hardly anyone says they want to go to college to learn more or to become a more fuller individual. Being able to make money, getting a job promotion, having future job security, these are the main points where students want to go to university in the United States. Next slide. Thank you. Now, when students are looking for a university, they're looking to make money. They're looking for rankings and focus. So they're looking for top schools within their GPA, the grade point average, because you cannot get into Harvard if you have a 92 average. That wouldn't be possible. Even when I went to Oxford University, they required American students who were not native speakers to have a TOEFL exam, even if they graduated from Columbia. So, there are different understandings of what you achieve coming out of different systems. So students are looking for academically strong departments within their interests. So for example, NYU, New York University, has a very strong art history department, the best in the country. So they might not be NYU is not as strong for linguistics, but they are for art history. So if you were interested in art history, you would try to get into NYU, and you wouldn't try to get into Harvard, for example, which has a weaker art history department. So it's not only about how a university is ranked, but how the department within that university is ranked, the department you're interested in. Students are also looking for research opportunities. So it's not just sitting in class. It's looking to do research with the professors, and that has some sort of global exposure. So students like to hit the lecture circuit, even though it can be daunting at times even for graduate students. I remember when I was a graduate student, I was flying all over Europe and giving talks on my research. And even at the undergrad level, we see many students are interested in presenting their research and research opportunities with laboratories and with academics in the humanities who have a very strong name and strong publications with high impact factors. Career support and internships is also one of the major factors that high school students look at when they are looking to move into the university domain. They want to be able to not just stay in the classroom, but to get their foot in the door, so to speak, And different schools have different internship and career services. A lot of the famous ones, if you do well, you can start out clerking in a judge's office or working as an intern at a big financial firm. And these are very important for students. Next slide, please. Admission rates. So there are many beautiful schools in the United States. Most of the top universities in the world are either in the United States and England, with the majority in the United States. If we can just scroll through the next 4 pictures, please, Maria. The next picture is of Harvard University, followed by nice brick buildings there. The first college in the United States, followed by Caltech. And the next picture, Caltech and MIT are arguably the 2 top tech universities in the world. City College in New York, right in the middle, next picture, has one of the more beautiful campuses. This is a good college, which you could get into with a high 80s average or low 90s average. Caltech and MIT and Harvard, you need in the high 90s. And next slide. And then there's some regional schools like Notre Dame, also quite beautiful. Different architectural styles. Some students prefer to live on campus where there's more opportunities to socialize, to stay on campus and have clubs and sports. Others prefer to be in a city. They want to work right away, and it really depends. To get into these colleges, next slide, please. To get into these colleges, we can see there's a pretty low acceptance rate. 37,000 people applied to Harvard a couple of years ago, and 2,000 got in. Columbia University has a very similar 36,000, 2,000 got in. So it is quite competitive. Now, if we look at a time series, next slide, please. If we look at a time series, we can see that this is from the Crimson Tide, which is a Harvard publication. We can see that the overall rate was 4.5% acceptance. Now, that is indicated here in red. What's indicated in gray is early action, where very good students apply early and they commit. They said, listen, if you accept us, we will go to the school. We will not go to any other school. These tend to be much stronger students who are applying, and it is a 14% rate there. So when you calculate the 4.9, 4.59, and a 14.5 by numbers, it comes to 2.4% overall. So it is quite difficult to get into schools like Harvard. We'll talk about what it depends on in a moment. Next slide, please. So Harvard is Harvard, but if we look regionally, there is, this is from 2023, fiscal year 2023, freshmen. We can see that a lot of the other schools are a lot easier to get into. This is broken down regionally. And we can see on the far left, the Ivy League schools like Harvard in 2023 went down from 4 to 3%. Columbia, again, 3.9%. All these are very difficult schools to get into. But if we move to the right for here, the Big Ten, we can see that, you know, Oregon is 86% and Michigan State is 88%. So it varies widely, but in each geographical location, there is usually a top school. Not always, but often there's a top school in the ACC, the Atlantic Coast. There is, and these are broken down by actually sports.
Anything else coming?
Can you hear me now?
At the moment, yes.
Okay, yeah. So the admission standards vary widely, with Stanford being just as hard to get into as Harvard and Duke harder to get into Penn State. What does it depend on? If we can go to the next slide, please. One, of course, is GPA, grade point average. To get into a top Ivy League school, you should have at least a 95 average. There are exceptions, of course, which we will talk about. But if you have an 88, 89% average, you're not getting into any of these top schools. Now, it also depends on which high school you have come from. If you have come from, now this goes back to the specialized high schools. If you have gone to a better high school, a better private school, or a stronger public school, that is taken into consideration. So a 99 in a high school in rural Iowa might be equivalent to a much lower grade in a specialized high school in Los Angeles or New York or a top private school. So the school that you go to and your GPA, how those two interact are important. Standardized test scores make a big difference as well. There is the SAT exam, which has become more and more optional, but not for top schools, top tier schools. And how you score out of 1,600, if you're scoring 15